Okay, just going to go ahead and get started here. I want to thank you once again for joining me and the Call to Serve podcast. My name is Michael Skelton. I'm your host and the creator of this podcast. I really appreciate everybody who listens in, and it helps in a big way. Not only monetarily, I do get just a little bit. Full transparency, it's very little, it's almost nothing, but I do get a little bit. But even more so, it helps just in getting this out there and furthering it, especially if you would be so kind as to share it, whether on Facebook, Twitter, any of the social media that you may use. Today, we are going to, as I speak right now and as we're recording this, it's Friday, January 12th. And as most everybody knows, coming up on Monday is Martin Luther King Jr. Day. And so no more fitting a time to talk about that than when it's coming up here. And I think it's a very important thing. There are a lot of things that the country and the bureaucrats and the politicians make a big deal out of that really have very little value and no true meaning, but this is not one of those. This is one of those things that we actually got right to make a big deal out of and to have a reminder for us every year. As all of you know, Martin Luther King Jr., he was one of many of the giants in the fight for civil rights, especially as it pertains to racial inequities and racial issues. And he is perhaps one of the biggest, if not the biggest icon, and one who was used by God to help finish out the long chapter that and the long injustice of one of the biggest sins of the country. And yes, I will go ahead and say, yes, I agree. It was a huge sin of the country. It was one of the worst chapters of this country's existence. And it was something that it was such a big thing that it took a long time to completely be able to move through. And he was able to help finish that out. It didn't happen during his time, but that was basically the beginning of the end, was during the 60s, and especially during the time that he took on the spotlight and led, for the most part, took the largest leadership role in finishing out the racial issues and the problems of segregation, of discrimination in our country. Now, let's go and take a quick second here to go ahead and address what some detractors are going to say, in that they'll say, well, today we still have racial issues. We still have discrimination. And my answer to you would be this. Yes, as far as in very small places and individual tiny little areas, yes. There you can probably point to individuals scattered far out and few between, and maybe even small little areas that truly are insignificant that might still be clinging to a part of that racial injustice and the bigoted way of thinking. I'll go ahead and submit that to you, but by and large and as a whole, the country has moved beyond that. One of the proofs of this is I would challenge you to point to a law that still enables racial discrimination. I would challenge you to point to modern court decisions that still make okay that kind of behavior. And yes, I know that there have been, people will probably say, well, look at Ferguson, Missouri. And they're going to, I'm not even going to go into all of the ones, but we all know a lot of the ones in the past, let's say 8 to 10 years, but especially the past maybe 6 or 8 that were brought forth in the news media as some sort of proof that we haven't moved beyond where we were in the 60s, where we truly had institutionalized racial discrimination. And I'm sorry, but you're wrong. For one, those things were extremely cherry picked. And it's funny because even though they cherry picked certain incidents, every single one of those incidents that they cherry picked, whether it was Ferguson, whether it was the law professor that claimed racial discrimination whenever police questioned him when he was breaking into his own home, whether it was any other of those, it's if it weren't so sad, it would be amusing because the ones that they cherry picked turned out, if you were to look at the facts, to not be racially motivated. There, some may have been truly pointed out to be wrongs, but they had no racial components. And some of them, it turned out that, for instance, the police in Ferguson, Missouri were not wrong in their actions. The person who tragically died was not killed because he was a black teenager. He was killed because he was committing terrible acts of violence against people, including police officers, and posed an incredible danger to his own community. No one's happy that these people died or were harmed, given just depending on which one you're talking about. But in the end, they were not caused by a racial component. This is going a little bit long, so I'll go ahead and try to move on and get back to the point of the whole thing. And that's to talk about a little bit about Martin Luther King and to celebrate him, to celebrate Martin Luther King Jr. Also, in just a minute, along with that, we'll point out some of those who, it's funny, actually will try to detract away from Dr. King and his legacy. And we're going to talk about those in just a minute. And you might be surprised, some of you might be surprised who the ones are who are trying to erase Dr. King and the works that he did. And I'll explain that in just a little bit whenever we get to it. Anyway, many may not know, this is just an interesting little fact, but there's a lot that may not know that Dr. King was actually not born Martin Luther King Jr. His father was Michael King, and when Dr. King was born, he was Michael King Jr. After he was only a few years old, he was still very young, the senior decided to change his own name to Martin Luther after the Protestant reformer. Martin Luther, the German Protestant reformer, just in honor of him and some of the works that he did. And since Dr. King was a junior, he went ahead and he wanted to change his name as well so that he could remain a junior. So that's how he became Martin Luther King Jr. I didn't know that for a long time. I knew that the Martin Luther was after the Protestant reformer, but I did not know that he was born with the name Michael first before it was changed by his father. Anyway, that's just an interesting little fact. As you know, Dr. King, he led so many marches, demonstrations, and made wide use of what we call civil disobedience, in which they technically are breaking the law with some of their demonstrations, but they're peaceful about it, which is a far throw away from what we see so many times today, especially in the mainstream media. We see mostly just violence. And the violence is being perpetrated by people who don't even understand what they're doing violence about. They don't even understand literally the reason that they're going out and doing this, except that they just want to be a part of something that they think makes them look cool. They just want to be trendy, really. Let's be honest. And it's sad. Many of them may just have their own wild issues in their own life. And it's sad that they feel that they have to join a movement of which they know nothing about, and of which is terrible, a terrible movement to begin with. And what I'm talking about, and I'll go ahead and put a name to it, is the Black Lives Matter movement. Now, I know a lot of feathers just got ruffled by even mentioning the BLM in a negative connotation, but I'm sorry, but it's true. It really is. And I'll tell you why. There's a lot of evidence towards it, but one of the biggest evidences of that is the fact that the BLM movement, by and large, and by all of the prominent leaders, both of the movement itself and the global foundation that is Black Lives Matter. Which there's those two, they're connected, but they're different things. The Black Lives Matter Foundation is an actual entity. It's a nonprofit, which is very crooked. It has crooked foundings. It has the leaders have questionable practices, both legally and ethically, but they are connected to the Black Lives Matter movement, and the movement itself is just what we see around the country. Uh, Put on, some demonstrations are put on by locals, but a lot of it is actually fed, and the flames are fanned by the Global Foundation and by others as well. Anyway, one of those evidences that the is all of the prominent leaders, and I'm not going to give you any quotes, but I just want you to go look because it's very easy to find. They don't try to hide it, but the leaders are actually trying to erase Dr. King and his works. They won't admit that part straight out, but they not only try to downplay, but they actually try to say that Dr. King was wrong in a lot in the way he went about it. Now they'll wrap it in compliment because they have to, because if they completely and outright disavow Dr. King, then they would get backlash that would utterly destroy them. They would be revealed for what they truly are. But it's crazy because they are doing everything up into, but not including that, with the words that they say and the actions that they do. Many say that he should have promoted violence. Many say that he was too weak on how he went about fighting the injustices, the racial injustices. But the irony of it is that he and the ones that followed him, they were so effective that they truly were a big part of why today we are no longer having laws and institutions that openly permit and encourage racism. And I really want you to look at some of those. There's very many. Just start Googling or on YouTube searching people who have talked about in the Black Lives Matter movement and in the foundation, the official foundation, who talk about Martin Luther King, and you'll see how they downplay, at the very least, at best they downplay it, and at worst they talk about him in a backhanded negative way. The other way in which I can tell you that it is very obvious in how the modern BLM movement and the foundation themselves are so different from the civil rights movement, most of the civil rights movement. Not all. There were outreaches that were pretty extreme and very negative, but especially associated with Dr. King, the another big difference is the fact that the modern BLM movement, they want to go back to segregating blacks and whites and other minorities. They openly encourage, and they also, instead of wanting to bring together like Dr. King did, they want to, rather than do that, they want to push the discrimination from one side to the other instead of ending discrimination. Let me go ahead and give you a little bit of advice. If you run across a person who espouses and promotes an ideology that discriminates against anybody, no matter who it is, guess what? Go the other way. Don't buy into it. There is no good reason whatsoever to say that we need to discriminate against anybody, even if you're white. Whether you're white, Hispanic, Asian, whatever, black, it is never, ever, now, nor will it be a good idea. Dr. King, and in just a minute, I'm going to play his most famous of his speeches, by far, the I Have a Dream speech. And it won't be the whole thing, but it'll be the biggest chunk of it. And in the entire thing, he speaks about coming together, bringing blacks and whites together, and joining together, holding hands at the tables of freedom, And he never once talks about we need to